Hello, I hope you're doing well. I'm coming on here to make a video to talk about the difference between mental health and mental illness. Bear with me because I do not plan on editing this, so this is just going to be a one-shot conversation. A few days ago, it was Bell Let's Talk Day. I don't know exactly what day it was, but the point being, I didn't post. And part of me feels guilty about not posting just because athlete mental health is such a huge part of my platform and is such a huge part of why I got into mental performance consulting in the first place. But the other part of me wasn't really interested in posting just because Bell Let's Talk Day can be so filled with noise. By noise, I mean that people will change their profile photos, they'll be sharing posts, they'll be saying things like, it's okay not to be okay. But often those people only ever talk about mental health on those days. And that can make that day feel somewhat disconnected if you are an athlete or a person who does struggle with a mental illness or is in a place where they're struggling with their mental health. When everybody on your feeds, social media feeds, is sharing on that day, sometimes it can just be like, yeah, but on every other day you don't share this. So I just wanted to make this video to separate myself from the noise. I didn't post that day, but I still know that it is valuable to talk about athlete mental health and mental illness. And I want to talk about the difference between the two of those today. So Bell Let's Talk campaign, the way it's written on their website is actually to reduce the stigma around mental illness. When a lot of people share, and a lot of what Bell shares is really talking about struggling with mental health. And those two, mental illness and mental health, are two different things, and they're not just opposite ends of a continuum. So it's not that you're either mentally healthy or you're mentally ill. You can have a mental illness and have mental health. So I'll get into that a little bit further. Mental health is being well. It is realizing your personal potential. It's being able to manage stress and contribute to your community. Those are all examples of mental health. Everybody has mental health. And your mental health is going to fluctuate. It's going to ebb and flow with the things that go on in your life. Some days you're going to feel like you have it all together, and some days you're just going to be like, am I the only one who has no idea what they're doing with their life? That's everybody. And the one way I've had it explained to me is that it's okay, like a bad day is normal. It's normal to have a bad day. If your bad day turns into a bad week, it might be a good time to check in with where you're at, see if there are any other coping strategies that you can be using to help yourself feel better. But if your bad week turns into a bad month, that might just be a sign that maybe it would be a good time to go and talk to a counselor or a therapist to brainstorm different strategies and just like voice the things that are going on for you. But just because you get to the point where you're seeking a professional help, which we don't have to hit our breaking point to go see a professional. It should be just part of our routines. Maybe that's just me. But if you do get to a point where you're like, I can't get out of this funk, I just need to talk to somebody, that doesn't mean that you have a mental illness. So a mental illness is something that is clinically diagnosed that affects the way you think and feel and act. So not everybody has a mental illness. In addition, somebody who is diagnosed with a mental illness are going to be things like major depressive disorder, general anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, eating disorders, and that's just to name a few. People who have been diagnosed with a mental illness also have mental health, and I think that it's really important to know that everybody has mental health, but just because you're struggling with your mental health doesn't mean that you have a mental illness either. And Bell Let's Talk Day is really about talking about the mental illness. And they want us to talk about mental illness so that we can reduce the stigma around it, because the more we can talk about something that is full of shame, the less shameful we feel about the thing because we are able to connect. So I do agree with the campaign and what it is working towards. But sometimes talking about mental health is an easy way to beat around the bush and avoid talking about mental illness. Knowing that they are different things, I just want to say that it is important we are talking about both. It is valuable to talk about mental health, But just know that when you say you're struggling with mental health, that's not the same as saying that you have a mental illness. With that, I want to say, let's talk about the major depressive disorder that makes it hard for you to get out of bed in the morning. Let's talk about the general anxiety disorder that overwhelms you when you are in a crowd. Let's talk about the OCD that makes it hard for you to tackle other important tasks in your day. Let's talk about the eating disorders that make it really hard for you to just enjoy supper out with your friends and family. Let's talk about side effects of medication, but also just to show appreciation for that fact that medication is helping you function and feel good. And I know that's just a few mental illnesses that I've identified, but let's talk about those if we're wanting to break the stigma. With that, I will talk. I will talk about how I was diagnosed with depression when I was 16. I was suicidal and never talked to anybody about it. The first medication I ever tried made me yawn so much that when I was at practice, I had to sit out because I could not catch my breath long enough to just complete a rep of a drill. Luckily, I found medication that worked for me later on. But the point being, like, I was ashamed that I was being put on medication. I was ashamed when I had to ask for a higher dose. I was ashamed when I started to see a therapist. As an athlete, I felt isolated from my team because I didn't know how to talk about what I was dealing with. When I was playing, I would downward spiral when I would make a mistake because I just attached my self-worth so much to my performance. So if I didn't perform well, I was a bad person. I ended up dropping out of a few school sports that I was a part of just because there were so many other things going on in my life at the time that I was struggling to manage. I felt pressure to be tough and to not show emotion, and that pressure to just bottle things up and do the thing that you need to do made it so much worse. I lost a lot of friends because they didn't realize what it was like to be a competitive athlete, which often means being busy every single weekend and being busy most nights of the week because you're going to practice and competitions. And I lost a lot of friends because I pulled away, and I pulled away because I didn't know how to tell them what was happening. That's mental illness. Throughout the time, so that was around 10 years ago, my mental health has fluctuated, knowing and reminding you that mental health and mental illness are different. So in the last 10 years, my mental health has fluctuated. Some days I was confident that depression was not something that would define me or not control me. But then other days, I just felt like I would never get out of the dark pit that depression is and feels like. But those fluctuations are the fluctuations in mental health. And I know some people say like, oh, my mental illness doesn't define me. And the first time I heard that, I'm like, okay, that's cool, but what does that even mean? So when I was originally diagnosed, I latched onto it. I grabbed onto it because I'm like, this is the thing that I've been feeling, and it makes so much sense. And I held on to it. I just believed that I was someone who would always be sad and I would always be hard on myself because I didn't know there was another option. Over time, I got to know myself better. I learned more about psychology and mental illness and mental health in general. And I just began to realize that my experience with mental illness shaped who I am, but it's not all that I am. I'm also compassionate. And I am also curious, and I'm all these other things. And sometimes my depression flares up, and a good day just means that I showered and remembered to brush my teeth. And I just accept all of those things in who I am as a whole, rather than seeing myself as someone who has depression or someone who is depressed. So if your mental health fluctuates, that's okay and that's normal. If you have a mental illness, that's also okay, and some days it's going to be more intense than others. My whole point in sharing this is just to educate the general population that maybe they don't have experience living with a mental illness, or they don't have anybody in their life who has experienced any mental illness. So I just wanted to talk about how there is a difference between mental health and mental illness. And if we want to reduce the stigma around mental illness, we need to be talking about mental illness rather than talking about struggling with mental health. And I think there is value in talking about our mindset and talking about where we're at mentally either way. But just know there's a difference. And I hope that me sharing about the difference between the two of those was helpful for you if you didn't realize there was a difference. If you did know that, I hope that me being able to share what I have been through has provided you with something to connect to, especially as athletes. It can feel really lonely when you have a mental illness and you don't know how to talk to people about it, and you don't want it to be all that you are, but you do know deep down that it shapes who you are. So if there was something that connected to you, or if there is something that would learn, I would love to hear from you. Let's talk.